Hello, everyone. I am Debbie Fox. I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence. I'm the Senior Housing Policy and Practice Specialist here at NNADV. We're going to go ahead and get started. It looks like we have a good group of people that are starting to come into the room. So I would just want to thank you for joining us today. The webinar you have joined is Housing Rights of Domestic and Sexual Violence Survivors During COVID-19. What you need to know about eviction protection. So hopefully you're in the right place. And I'm joined here today with some of my colleagues and experts in the field around COVID-19 eviction protections and housing protections for survivors. I'm joined by Renee Williams, Senior Staff Attorney at the National Housing Law Project, Mariel Block, Staff Attorney at the National Housing Law Project, and Carl Ng, Director of Legal Initiatives at the National Alliance for Safe Housing. So during each section of their portion of the webinar, they'll introduce themselves and tell you a little bit more about themselves, but I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And just so everybody knows, we are going to record the webinar, and we will be sending it out to you afterwards. So you'll have all the information in the recording and the slide deck, as there's a lot of really great information, and there's a lot of really great resources, especially at the end. So you'll be able to have all of those resources to access quickly. And we want to make sure, yes, I see there's some hellos in the chat box that are happening. And please introduce yourselves in the chat box. And we encourage you to ask questions in the chat box during the presentation. We all will be answering them in real time. And if for some reason we don't happen to know the answer to a question you might have, we will definitely get back to you and do some research and send it your way. So yes, good to see everybody and all the chats that are happening in the slide deck. So I think we're not slide deck, in the chat box, but I was going to say, could you move the slide deck, please, to the next slide? One more. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk a little bit in my section here for about 10 minutes is how the survivors and housing insecurity has been impacted by the pandemic. So if we could have the next slide, please. I'm sure this is not a surprise to a lot of folks on the call if you have been working in the context of domestic and sexual violence and in particular housing, but we have seen some real, impacts how the pandemic has impacted survivors. So there's definitely additional housing challenges for the needs of survivors, additional barriers for survivors of color, and we are seeing more and more research that's coming out over time that there's an increased incidence of domestic violence during COVID-19. So we're going to be talking a little bit more about, how to keep survivors safely housed and the long-term impacts of eviction. But what we do know is during this time, not only from the health perspective in the pandemic, is we're saving lives by keeping people housed during this time, but there's also, we're providing safety for survivors, and we're also the long-term impacts of eviction, even without a pandemic and quote unquote normal times, we know that there's long-term impacts around mental health and increased stressors for survivors when they are impacted as a result of domestic violence or sexual assault. So just a little bit to give you a little bit of context about the field, it's been a year now. We all mobilized very quickly to start addressing the needs of survivors during a time that was filled with so much uncertainty. So we saw programs and DVSA coalitions shift their services very quickly and rapidly to provide services either in hotel motels or making shelters and housing programs more socially distant, and we just saw really quick changes and people mobilizing to meet the needs of survivors. And we know that while there's silver linings and there's hope with the vaccine and things are changing in terms of some of the health responses, we still have a ways to go, and we're not out of the woods yet. So it's super important for us to still keep survivors housed during this time. And we knew, before the pandemics, there was really still quite a bit of there was quite a lot of gaps in terms of survivors having access to housing. We do an annual count. The National Network to End Domestic Violence does an annual count, the Domestic Violence Count Report. And in that one day, it's typically in September. And that day, typically there's about over 11,000 requests for services that are unmet. And the majority of those, 70% of those, are requests for housing and shelters. So that was in pre-pandemic time. So we're seeing some of that exacerbated during the pandemic. So unfortunately, we have seen just the field responding, making changes, changing things very quickly to be able to keep survivors housed during this time. And what we're hearing and what the research is starting to tell us now is there is increased violence and impacts on survivors. So if we could go to the next slide, please. There's just so many additional stressors. While it is the right response for us to socially distance and to encourage the stay-at-home orders to curb the spread of COVID-19, then we're also seeing what we call or what has been called a shadow pandemic that for survivors, this has been a real challenge that they're very much at risk for additional violence in their homes if they're isolated from their services, their workplaces, if they're, with their abuser at home and seeing increased violence. So we're seeing some of the research. There was a study that just came out recently, a national study, let me pull it up really quick, from the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, CCJ. They just released a study, which you can get, you'll have in that link on the slide when you get the slide deck, but just basically what we have heard and kind of assumed anecdotally, but they have done some research and looked at different access points for survivors, whether it's hotlines or health records or other police logs. They have seen about over an 8% increase in domestic violence as a result of stay-at-home orders. And so while there's a lot of evidence to support the increase, it's still, people are still trying to look at all the different factors that are exacerbating that, whether it's economic impacts or family stressors and unemployment stress. And obviously for those who are homeschooling and taking care of kiddos, there's also additional stressors for people working in the home with their abuser. And so we also are seeing during this time that there's additional risk and housing insecurity for survivors and survivors of color and immigrant survivors and LGBTQ survivors. We're seeing higher rates of housing insecurity and evictions and poverty. We're seeing the impact of the gender wage gap. And we're, hearing and learning more about the increased rates of sexual harassment and domestic violence as it relates to the pandemic. So, these times, like similar to natural disasters, when there's limited resources or additional stressors, there's often oppressive practices that come into place in workplaces and at the home that impact survivors, and in particular, survivors of color. The next slide, please. So just here's another slide just to touch base too on the impacts of sexual violence during COVID. As we know, prior to COVID, there was concerns and issues as it related to vulnerabilities to housing and landlords in terms of landlords harassing survivors in their housing, and they can be left with no choice of experiencing the harassment by their landlord or trying to stay in their housing. So we're seeing increased vulnerabilities there. And the National Alliance to End Sexual Violence also surveyed their member programs, and found that 40% of the rape crisis centers have seen increased demand for services. And due to the health-related issues around COVID-19 and the healthcare facilities being maxed out, there's fewer sexual assault forensic exams, and there's been decreases around that. So, we're seeing at this time that there is, there's a need for additional services, but often with the isolation during COVID, it's sometimes hard for survivors to have access to those resources. So I do want to leave us on, somewhat of a positive note, and the other presenters will also tell you the great resources and different federal responses that are happening and state and local responses that are happening as a result of the pandemic. But there was a recent study that came out of Harris County around relationships and the impact of COVID-19. And so what we're seeing is just there is increased domestic and sexual violence, but what we're seeing is that, the domestic and sexual violence programs, advocates, all of you, the support that you've given, the programs are a vital lifeline. So there was really good information in this recent study out of Harris County, just talking about how DV and SA programs were lifelines, really helped survivors get through these really challenging times. And as we know, and as the other presenters will talk about more in depth, just cash assistance, money, resources to pay the rent, any kind of supports around childcare and just access to resources really makes a big difference in the life of survivors and helps mitigate some of the increased stressors that happened during COVID-19 as it relates to survivors. So there's a lot of resources on both of those slides in terms of stats and the impact of COVID for SA and DV survivors. So definitely take a look at those. And I think Renee is next. So I'm going to pass it over to Renee, who's going to talk more about the eviction moratoriums.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie. And, I think the framing that Debbie provided is really, really important. I guess I'll introduce myself really quick. My name is Renee Williams. I am a senior attorney at the National Housing Law Project. And I work a lot with folks on who are my co-presenters, as well as folks who are tuning in on really advocating for the housing rights of domestic and sexual violence survivors who live in rental housing. So that's a lot of what I focus on at NHLP. And, I do want to take a step back and just really underscore, because we're talking primarily about evictions today, just something that Debbie said about, a lot of the structural issues that are in place, structural racism, structural economic inequality, all of those issues are really coming to a head during the pandemic, and it's really magnified the need and has really demonstrated how many folks are really, always just short of the edge of losing their housing. And that's particularly true for survivors. So I'm just going to speak really briefly on, the COVID eviction protections that are in place, and just give some updates, the latest information. I will say, this information is changing very quickly. The landscape, as things develop on the national level, you may also see movement at your state and local levels. So, there are a lot of resources that are compiled at the end of the presentation, and the slides are going to go out to folks after the webinar. NNEDV, NASH, NHLP, we all have COVID-19 resource pages. And so I would just definitely encourage folks to visit those pages just to get the most recent updates, because, in a week, some of this information may not be as up to date. So I just wanted to note that. Next slide, please. So one thing that I wanted to speak to, and I think it's, just as the country has really struggled and grappled with this unprecedented, and at least in modern times, health emergency, is how to not only keep folks in their homes who are already vulnerable, but also connecting that to the overarching public health objectives of containing the spread of coronavirus. So probably the most visible intervention in the housing space that that has been taken on by the federal government is the CDC has issued a moratorium on evictions. And so that moratorium first took effect in September of 2020. And it has actually been extended a couple of times, once in December, once in January. And, it's had to be extended because we're not out of this crisis, right? And so right now, the current moratorium is set to expire. The current extension of the moratorium is set to expire on March 31st. But what I wanted to do is provide a little bit of an update of what we know right now. So, as far as we know, the signs are really pointing to there being an extension of the moratorium after March 31st, but the information is really limited. We've just this week started to see, stories in the news about the administration considering the extension. And, there have been steps taken by the White House, by the administration, to go through the process within the federal government that would, that's necessary to, proceed any extension. So that's working its way through, right now. But as of right now, all we know is that the moratorium is set to end on the 31st. And so that goes to my earlier point of just making sure that, you check the web pages and resources that we'll share, just to get the latest information about whether or not the moratorium has been extended. So what the moratorium does, and I don't, we've done a few webinars on this. I don't want to kind of retread old territory. But what it does is it says that, while the moratorium is in place, there can't be evictions. So if folks are having trouble paying their rent, they can't be evicted on that basis, right? They can't be evicted, because they're having trouble paying rent. And, so a couple of just important things to remember. One is that, if folks are having, if clients that you're working with are having trouble paying their rent, if they're getting behind on rent, and they haven't filled out the CDC moratorium form, that, that's something that they should do to protect themselves. Just to make sure, because that is a prerequisite for exercising the protections, and housing providers are not required to share the existence of the fact that the moratorium is in effect with tenants. And so there is still this information gap, right? That the word is not necessarily getting to everybody, that the moratorium is in place. There have also been, so that's number one. Number two is there have been some legal challenges to the moratorium. And what I wanted to share, and there were a couple of court decisions, that, basically sort of cast the moratorium in a negative light and basically said that it was not, it was an expansion too far of federal authority. And what the Department of Justice has said is, and I've included a couple of links here just for you to see, is that in their view, the moratorium is still in effect. It applies, and that the decisions in those cases are limited to the parties that are involved. So if you're getting questions locally, is the moratorium still in effect? I heard about these court cases. You can look at these particular decisions that speak to DOJ's view on the matter. So, And if folks have legal questions, or questions about where the litigation is at, again, please feel free to reach out to me at NHLP. Happy to talk more about that. Let's see. Okay, so can we do next slide, please? So, I think one of the things that's important for survivor advocates to know is that there are exceptions to the moratorium, and including things like criminal activity, potential damage to the unit, etc. And a lot of times, these are the grounds, right, that survivors are evicted under because of the abuse that's committed against them. So which, there are protections in place, which I will touch on really quickly for the purposes of time. But the real takeaway here is, one, we have heard of evictions that are still moving forward. And, even though the CDC moratorium is applying, it's really, really important that if you're working with a client and they say, oh, I got an eviction notice, please do the referral to legal aid as soon as possible. Because even if perhaps they can't physically be removed from their home, some portion of the eviction, depending on state and local law, may be going forward. And we have a couple of links here of, contacting legal aid offices. I'm sure a lot of folks on the line have relationships with their local legal aid. And so, really the upshot is don't, just because the client may think, oh, there's a moratorium in place, I'm okay. Any sort of eviction notice really needs to be looked at and referred to an attorney. Next slide, please. So there are also, in addition to the federal moratorium, there are also state moratoriums as well. And because of the nature of how landlord-tenant law works across the country, those are going to look different in different states. So just wanted to provide a link for folks to look at to see if there is an eviction moratorium that's in effect in their state or in their locality. And then that list also speaks to moratoriums on utility shutoffs, which are also happening as folks are, having difficulty paying utilities. And then to the earlier point that I'd made about, there is an eviction moratorium in place, but because of the exceptions in the moratorium, survivors may still be being evicted because of the abuse committed against them. And so it's really important for folks to have a really good grasp of, if your client is living in any of the federally subsidized housing programs or federal programs that are covered by VAWA, just remember the Violence Against Women Act, housing protections. There's also the Fair Housing Act, which can provide protections for survivors. A lot of states have protections as well against the eviction of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And you can go to our website, to find out more about these various protections, but again, just keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Okay, and then let me just look really quickly. Thank you, Carlo, for sharing the eviction declaration form in English. The CDC also has a Spanish version, and then other advocacy groups have translated in a multitude of other languages as well. Am I correct that it's only for non-payment? So, there's a lot of discussion about this, and, I don't want to, the moratorium is focused on non-payment of rent, but there are arguments, legal arguments that could be made that the moratorium applies in other contexts. And I don't want to derail us too much because we only have an hour, but if you have specific questions about the moratorium and sort of legal arguments that you may want to make for survivors or tenants, yes, when in doubt, refer to legal aid. And you know, if you're working with legal aid folks and they have questions, they can reach out to the National Housing Law Project and NASH as well. Like, you know, we're all thinking through these questions, but that's a really good question from the audience member who posed that. So I'm probably way over time, so I'm going to kick it over to Carlo, and keep your questions coming. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was really, really helpful and really great information about the status of the eviction moratorium. And yes, for folks who are just joining, the PowerPoint and the recording of the webinar are all going to be circulated after we're done with the presentation. And usually that takes about 24 to 36 hours to 24 to 48 hours. So no worries there. So now I'm going to just provide some updates. Really, I'm going to provide an overview of the latest COVID relief package and tell you some of the different components to that package. And then Mariel is going to provide a more detailed, information about how folks can be eligible for some of the emergency rental assistance relief that is part of the last COVID relief package and also the packages before that. So I'm going to start with the American Rescue Plan Act. So many of you know the American Rescue Plan Act was signed into law by President Biden on March 11. It is a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package that's designed to speed up the country's recovery from COVID, as well as the ongoing recession. Like I said, there's a lot of different parts to this package, and they're all interrelated, really designed, again, to help us get out of the pandemic and help us economically. But for our purposes today, I'm just going to focus on providing high-level takeaways that relate specifically to domestic violence, sexual assault programs, as well as the housing and homelessness funds that's part of the Rescue Plan Act. If you want more detail, we really encourage you to take a look at NNADV and NASH's fact sheet, where we really hone in on the parts of the American Rescue Plan Act that apply to DVSA programs, as well as survivors who are trying to access the housing and homeless assistance. So if someone could post that link, that would be really great in the chat box. Thanks so much. So the American Rescue Plan Act provides about $450 million in funds that are specific to domestic and sexual violence. This includes $180 million under the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, or FVPSA funds. And these funds, as many of you know, is for emergency shelter and flexible funding for domestic violence programs. There's another $18 million for tribes, and that's in addition to the 10% allocated from the $180 million of the FVPSA funds. There's another $49.5 million for culturally specific services for domestic violence and sexual assault survivors. And this is a new program. It's a brand new program, and the funds are designed to go directly into the hands of culturally specific organizations to serve survivors of color. There's also $198 million for rape crisis centers. There's another $2 million for the National Domestic Violence Hotline, of which $1 million is allocated to the Strong Hearts Native Helpline. In terms of the housing and homelessness assistance, the package provides $21.6 billion in emergency rental assistance that is going to be administered by the Treasury Department. Now this amount, this $21.55 billion, is in addition to the $25 billion that was provided last December through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So that's the actual name of the program, ERAP. That is also administered by the Treasury Department, and Maria will talk more about what that program is and how folks can be eligible for that assistance. But just know that this $21.55 billion is in addition to an existing amount that was doled out last December in the amount of $25 billion. So these emergency rental assistance funds are being distributed to states, localities, and territories throughout the country that will either run their own programs, run their own emergency rental assistance programs, or they're going to designate partner organizations in their communities who will run these programs. There is a Treasury, an FAQ that has come out of Treasury. It's been updated a few times. The last version was published recently on March 16th. There's a link to it that we can provide for you in the chat box. And basically it answers a lot of questions that folks have in the field about how exactly is money going to be, who's going to be eligible for this money? There were a lot of questions about what services and housing related services does it actually cover? What about folks in manufactured housing, et cetera, et cetera. So if you would like to see that and get answers to those kinds of questions, please do take a look at the FAQ, which will be linked in the chat box. There's as part of the Housing and Homelessness Assistance and the Emergency Rental Plan Act, there's also $5 billion in emergency housing vouchers. So these vouchers are available to anyone who is at risk or who is at risk of experiencing homelessness or are currently experiencing homelessness. This includes survivors who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and human trafficking. The money equates to about 65,000 vouchers nationally, which will be administered by public housing authorities or PHAs. And HUD is going to notify the public housing authorities of their voucher allocations within 60 days of the enactment of the act. So we're looking at about May 10th. At around May 10th, HUD should be providing these vouchers to the public housing authorities. HUD is going to distribute the vouchers using a formula, a brand new formula that ensures geographic diversity, and it also takes into account the capacity of the PHA. What's really important to note about these vouchers is that there's something unique about them. It's different from regular housing choice vouchers. And what's different about these vouchers is that because they are really vouchers created in response to the pandemic, starting October 2023, public housing authorities cannot reissue the vouchers when families that are using them no longer need them. So basically, come October 2023, they can sunset if the vouchers are not being used by the family, or the vouchers that the families are using, they no longer need them. HUD should be coming out with guidance about these vouchers. And we are actually going to be speaking with HUD about how survivors, as well as domestic violence and sexual assault programs, can access these vouchers. If you have any initial thoughts about how these vouchers can serve survivors better, please feel free to share them with those thoughts with us now in the chat box, or email me, because we really, really want to bring your feedback and your suggestions to HUD and as much of that as possible. We also encourage you to reach out to your local public housing authorities to see how survivors can access these vouchers. Practically speaking, the housing authorities are likely waiting for their marching orders from HUD, right? They need to know how many vouchers, how many COVID vouchers they're going to get, and then how they should be administering them. But it's never too early to reach out to your local housing authority and give them a heads up that you, as a local domestic violence and sexual assault program, would really like to work with them to make sure that these COVID vouchers are actually reaching survivors who really need them. So please do that. And if you need some tips or advice or have questions about where your local housing agency may be, please feel free to reach out to us. So continuing on with the different components of the American Rescue Plan Act and the Housing and Homelessness Assistance Grants, there is another $5 billion that is for homelessness assistance. So that is different from the $5 billion that is for emergency vouchers. This is $5 billion devoted for homelessness assistance and mainly for capital investments. The assistance is going to go to quote unquote participating jurisdictions, which are states and localities and territories. Basically, in the fact sheet that NNEDV and NASH created, there's a link to the estimated amounts that these state and territory participating jurisdictions will be receiving. The funds will be distributed within 30 days using the fund program's allocation formula. So this is an interesting kind of mix of different programs. So this is clearly homelessness assistance, but the way that it's being doled out is using a home program formula, which home is not typically thought of as a homeless assistance stream stream for financing. But in this context, home is being used because it was a political decision. There's been a lot of holdup in terms of using ESG or Emergency Solutions Grant as a way to get out the money, because right now I think there's only been about 10% of the COVID ESG money that's been doled out. And so there was a political decision that was made to use another funding stream to get this money out quickly. So like the emergency vouchers that I talked about before, these homeless assistance grants can be used for survivors who are fleeing or attempting to flee domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and human trafficking. This assistance is supposed to be flexible in that it can be used for a variety of different purposes, including developing supportive housing, developing non-congregate shelters, developing regular affordable housing, as well as providing rental assistance. The coalition, the Low Income Housing Coalition, has a fact sheet about all these different kinds of housing and homeless assistance, so feel free to look at that. And again, we are speaking with the different offices at HUD to see how we can work with them to ensure that survivors and programs like yours can access this assistance in a way that is truly equitable. If you have thoughts about how this can be done, or even stories about the challenges you've faced trying to access these COVID funds, please share that in the chat box or email me later. So just very quickly, to quickly outline the other components of the housing and homelessness assistance grants, there's a $750 million in flexible block grant housing assistance for tribal and Native Hawaiians, $100 million in rental assistance to rural households living in USD financed properties, $9.96 billion to help homeowners avoid foreclosure through the Homeowner Assistance Fund, $4.5 billion for utility assistance through the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, and then another $500 million for water assistance through the Low-Income Household Drinking Water and Wastewater Emergency Assistance Program. There's also a lot of other assistance, including direct impact payments and enhancements to unemployment insurance, the earned income tax credit, and the child tax credit, all really, really, really important issues and enhancements for the people that we serve. So please definitely take a look at NNEDV and NASH's fact sheet if you want more information about that. And with that, I'll turn it over to Muriel.
Thanks so much, Carlo. So I'll be talking about other sources of emergency rental assistance, a little more about the ERAP program, and also will show you some resources for how to look up the local rental assistance program in your area. So there were three sources of federal rental assistance dollars during the pandemic. The first was the CARES Act in 2020, and this provided funding to multiple streams of funding. So that's a little bit confusing for some people. It added funding to CDBG funds, emergency solutions grant funds, home and some other funds. And it also created the Coronavirus Relief Act, which was a very large fund that at the time of enactment through the CARES Act could be used by states and large localities for a number of purposes, including emergency rental assistance. So some older emergency rental assistance programs earlier and established in 2020 are funded by CARES Act funding and very often Coronavirus Relief Fund funds. In December of 2020, the Congress passed the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, and this act committed $25 billion to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, or ERAP funds. And then, as you heard from Carlo, the American Rescue Plan Act added an additional $21.55 billion to the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. So right now you're likely to be seeing a lot of emergency rental assistance programs being launched using ERAP funds, these new programs. I'll quickly go over the eligibility for these programs. A person is eligible if they meet three requirements. First, at least one member of the household must have either qualified for unemployment benefits or experienced a reduction in household income, incurred significant costs, or experienced other types of COVID-19 related financial hardship, and due directly or indirectly to the COVID-19 outbreak. The second is that a member of the household must be able to demonstrate a risk of homelessness or housing instability. And third, the household income must be less than 80% of the area media income. The ERAP program also has to prioritize households with 50% AMI or less, or people who have been unemployed for at least the 90-day period preceding the date of application. ERAP funds cover broadly 3 different programs under the Consolidated Appropriations Act, 3 different purposes. 1 is financial assistance, 2 is housing stability services, and 3 are administrative costs. The American Rescue Plan Act also added a 4th allowable use for that $21.55 billion, which also includes eviction prevention services, which can be funded, which also can be funded covered by ERAP funds. Financial assistance covers rent, rental arrears, utility and home energy costs, and utility and home energy costs arrears, as well as other housing expenses that were incurred directly or indirectly due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some of those other expenses include relocation expenses, security deposits, rental fees, application and screening fees, internet service, and reasonably accrued late fees. So this is all important to know for people you're assisting. These are all covered costs that can be covered by ERAP funds. With regard to housing stability services, a pretty wide array of housing stability services can also be funded. This includes housing counseling, case management, fair housing counseling. Relevant to this audience is housing related services for survivors of domestic violence or human trafficking, legal services, and other specialized services for individuals with disabilities or seniors who need support services to access or maintain housing. Now I think we can go, let me see if I can share screen. Yeah, great. Let's see. Okay, can you see my browser now? So these are some resources. We included the links on the slide, which you'll get. But these are some places where you can go to look up your local rental assistance program. The first is National Council of State Housing Agency has a emergency housing assistance webpage that is tracking ERAP programs by state. So it's really convenient. You can just click on your state and it will link to the latest information. Again, this is specifically for ERAP funds and not earlier CARES Act programs. And another resource is the National Low Income Housing Coalition Emergency Rental Assistance Program website. And this also has a number of views where you can look up your local program in your state or locality. I think it's being updated right now, unfortunately, so you can't see all of the views right now, but there's a bunch of good information here. We have this link for you too. And this has a pretty comprehensive list of programs that has both CARES Act funded programs as well as federal ERAP funded emergency rental assistance programs. Let me stop this share.
I think Carlo is going to talk about immigration.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was just waiting for the slides to get back up. There's always so much tech that we need to be mindful of. Okay, yes, so we are going to talk about immigration issues. Oh, sorry, let me start my video so I can see, you can see me. Hello, everyone. So there were some really great questions in the chat box, and please keep them coming. We're trying to answer them as they come. I didn't realize there was a chat box and also a Q&A, so we're trying to look at both and answer questions as they come up. So yeah, Jenny, I don't know who can actually see that my answers or other folks' answer publicly. So if folks aren't seeing it, Jenny, if you could fix that, that would be great. Thanks so much. So there was a question in the chat box about housing choice vouchers, and if folks want to learn more about how to access those vouchers, there is a fact sheet that we provided. There's a link to it in the Q&A, and I think it would be a resource that would be helpful for anyone who's unfamiliar with vouchers. The only caveat I would say is that in that fact sheet, we talk about immigration status requirements, which is a big part of accessing federal housing resources. And a lot of programs are immigration status requirements. But I do want to highlight that for the COVID relief assistance, Mariel talked about the housing assistance that is available under the CARES Act or the COVID relief funds, as well as the ERAP, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Those dollars do not have federally imposed immigration restrictions. And it's very clear in the statute that there are no federally imposed immigration restrictions for those programs and the housing assistance that comes out of those funds. So what that means is that state and local governments cannot and should not be creating immigrant access prohibitions for these programs, either directly and explicitly, or by requiring that tenants, for example, have Social Security numbers. So if you're experiencing something different locally, like you're seeing that some of these COVID dollars, there are some of these attachments being attached to those in order to access those funds, please let us know and contact us. In terms of the American Rescue Plan Act housing and homelessness assistance, it's too early for us to know for sure whether or not there are immigration status restrictions attached to those funds. There are none that appear in the statute, but because of the way that the funding is being allocated and distributed, there might be, but it's really unclear right now. So what we would really encourage you to do is take a look at the FAQ. So NASH and the National Immigrant Women's Advocacy Project, we put together an FAQ about housing assistance that's available for immigrant survivors during COVID. And in that FAQ, there's a series of questions about sort of what generally immigrant survivors are eligible for when it comes to housing assistance, things like HUD programs, rural development programs, the low-income housing tax credit program, and then what kinds of immigration restrictions exist for programs during COVID. So anything related to the COVID relief packages. And so we sort of outline all of that. We also talk about emergency shelter and transitional housing as well. So please do take a look at that. There's a lot of detailed information in there. And I just want to provide a quick word on public charge, because I know that that has been a big issue on everyone's minds who work with immigrants, not just immigrant survivors, but immigrants all across our country. On March 9th, 2021, the US Department of Homeland Security, DHS, did announce that the agency would stop implementing the 2019 public charge rule. And this means that the 2019 public charge rule is no longer in effect. Remember though, that even though there is no 2019 public charge rule anymore, there is still a public charge test. And this test was there before the 2019 public charge rule. And so there's still a public charge test that applies, but this test is very, very different. So this public charge test, which again is the pre-2019 public charge rule test, does not apply to legal permanent residents. The public charge test does not apply to US citizens. It does not apply to survivors applying for or who have been granted immigration relief under VAWA, U visa, or T visa programs. The test also does not impact survivors who are seeking or have been granted asylum or refugee status. The test also does not impact anyone who is seeking or has been granted special immigrant juvenile status, or SIJS. So what that means is survivors who have or are applying for one of these immigration statuses, they can and they should continue to use any government programs that they qualify for. If folks have questions about that, let me see. Okay, so it sounds like that there are issues coming up in certain localities about immigration restrictions. Yes, so let's definitely talk about that after the webinar, and we'll follow up with you for sure. Okay, and then is there another section, or are we in Q&A now, Debbie? Okay, we have resources. So here are some resources that we have. There's quite a bit of information about the CDC moratorium. If folks need to contact legal aid offices, we have a couple of links there for you to contact folks in those offices. There's also more information about state eviction and utility shutoff moratoriums through the Eviction Lab. There's the Low Income Housing Coalition's really helpful fact sheet on the American Rescue Plan. And then of course there's NNEDV and NASH's fact sheet about the American Rescue Plan Act as well. The FAQs from the Treasury Department on rental assistance. And then there's a couple of informational sheets about and trackers and resources about the emergency rental assistance programs. Next slide. Okay, and here are more resources. I think folks were wondering about some of our COVID resource pages. So they are all there for you to look at. We also provide a couple of additional links to background studies that we mentioned in our presentation. Next slide. Okay, so it looks like we have about 8 minutes for Q&A. If there are some questions, Debbie, did you want to facilitate this part?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. So far I think we've responded to all the questions in the chat box so far in real time. So if anybody has any other questions that you would like to have us while we're here answer for you, please just put it in the chat box and we can respond. And then also you're also welcome, you have all of our contact information just to reach out to us individually as well. If you think of something later, we're happy to be a resource ongoing as all these new resources and changes are happening with the eviction moratorium. So we're all kind of learning as we go because things are changing very quickly, like everyone had mentioned.
Debbie, there was a question sort of further up that I thought would be helpful for kind of all the panelists to maybe chime in. And it's this issue of, because there's an eviction moratorium in place, it's really hard for clients who aren't already housed to be able to locate housing. And so is there any, are there strategies that folks can think of about, sort of addressing that issue if there isn't, affordable housing inventory where folks, have their service areas, which I think is a really good question. And I don't know if some of the other panelists have thoughts about that piece.
I mean, I'm just thinking of some of the conversations I've heard about challenges, like some landlords wanting to take some of the money. So there are kind of exceptions to potentially work around. So to have someone, and I think this is in limited cases, but have the person pay directly. There's conversations around that, but I do think, yeah, we're in the nexus of, in this many communities, rural and in cities, of just, we know an affordable housing crisis, and there is a lot of work that's happening at the national level to try to address that as we move forward. But yeah, if anybody has any ideas, obviously building lots of relationships with landlords is really critical. But if anyone, yeah, else on the panel or in the box, if you want to share some of your strategies to get landlords engaged and on board to house folks, that would be super helpful.
Debbie, it looks like there's a question about Social Security numbers. Right, for housing assistance from the CARES Act or the Emergency Rescue, the Emergency Rental Assistance plan, there should not be any kind of, there are no federally imposed requirements when it comes to immigration requirements. And so, but what is happening is that locally we're seeing some of those restrictions being imposed. And so there are different advocacy strategies and arguments you can make with your states and localities about why that shouldn't be. And they are primarily legal arguments. And so we're happy to share that with you afterwards.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Kara mentioned the issue of having people in motels, but yeah, we're at a place where people are needing the transition to permanent housing out of motels, and have vouchers, but are having challenges trying to find housing. I mean, we are hearing of models in some cities where, and this could be possible with the home funds, where, you know, motels are being converted into permanent housing. So there's that is a strategy that some communities are doing, is taking some of those funds and obviously those hotels would need to have the ability to, you know, cook and all those things. So it's, you know, they would have to be either already a kind of like an extended stay, or something that would be able to be converted to longer term housing. So we have another question from Rebecca. Do states and localities have discretion to limit who is eligible for ERAP funds? I don't know if Marielle or Carlo or Renee, you want to take that?
I can add that. I can answer that. States and localities do have discretion to set further prioritization categories for emergency rental assistance. However, for things like immigration status, we argue that states do not have discretion to exclude undocumented immigrants, for example. And the main sort of justification for that is a federal court case, Poder versus City of Phoenix. But, you know, we're still working on that sort of advocacy and enforcement there.
And just to piggyback off of Marielle, I was trying not to get legally technical, but it's essentially a preemption argument legally, that because immigration is a field that the federal government occupies and has always occupied, that states and localities should not be adding immigration restrictions where the federal government has been silent or hasn't said anything about it. So, so that's part of the rationale as well.
So we have about 1 or 2 more minutes if there's any last minute questions. Yeah, and I'm also just thinking, like, with all these new resources, just however people, your organizations and you all can be part of any access or having those conversations to try to get access to some of those resources is really critical at this time. Let's see, we have something from Rebecca. Is there a similar argument for local enforcement of immigration law by LEO? Is there a document out there that exists to distribute?
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Mary. I was going to point to NHLP's resources, so go ahead.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. So we do have some memos that talk about immigration restrictions and have some legal analysis to help local advocates advocate against any immigration restrictions they're seeing in their programs. And we can add the link to the chat.
Yeah, the link for folks who are looking for those, if you look at I think it's the second resource slide, where it says National Housing Law Project Resources, the first couple of bullets, it's the slide that's up right now. Those are the 2 memos that NHLP has produced. And then, you know, also Nash and NEWAP have done, you know, a really deep dive into shelter and rental assistance. So there are resources, but if folks, you know, have more questions or want to talk through legal arguments, please let us know. And then there was one more question just about, has anyone successfully used the CDC eviction moratorium to stop an eviction? And so there have been you know, at least for initial, taking an initial look, you know, it has been shown that the CDC order has, you know, prevented, you know, folks from being evicted, and, you know, has helped limit the spread of COVID-19. I think one of the issues, and I just wanted to, and I know we're over time, just reiterate, is that, you know, folks, whether, you know, whether or not there's an eviction moratorium in place, folks should always, if there's an eviction notice, refer to legal aid. And so, and there are some, as I mentioned before, some gaps in the moratorium that, you know, where survivors can be vulnerable to eviction if the eviction is premised on things like criminal activity, et cetera. So it's always really important to know what protections exist for survivors where you are. Yeah, and I know we're over time, so Debbie, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you, Renee. Yeah, I just want to thank my co-presenters. I think Muriel had to get off already, but thanks, Carlo and Renee, for just all the wealth of information and all the resources. So I'm appreciative of you all in the field as you're working on the ground to get these resources to survivors who really need all the financial and housing resources as soon as possible. So thank you all. We're going to send out the slides, all the information, and then we're always available for resources. And I appreciate Rebecca for appreciating us for how quickly we put this info together. Yeah, so kudos to everyone. And so hopefully it'll be of good use to you all. And yeah, that's it. Thanks and take care.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.